Looking back, I never thought I'd be one of those guys. One of those husbands who gets blindsided by the person he shared almost his whole life with. Claire and I met in college, one of those simple stories. We had classes down the same hallway, bumped into each other enough times that eventually I worked up the nerve to ask her out. From there, things fell into place fast. We married a couple years later and had David not long after. For almost 30 years, we were that solid couple, the one others looked up to, and that kind of stability suited me. I thought I knew who she was. She was respected in her career, a high school English teacher, someone students still came back to visit long after graduation. I had my own steady path in finance, working up the ladder with a government contractor. The job wasn't glamorous, but it was solid, and it let us build the life we wanted. We had a little house on the edge of town, where things were quiet. After years of work, we even managed a few vacations, simple ones. Nothing big, just us on a beach somewhere, sipping on watered-down cocktails and getting sunburned. I always thought those were the best of times. Life wasn't perfect, but it was real. When David got married, I figured the next chapter would bring us even closer. Now we were empty nesters, just Claire and me. It felt like the right time for new things, new memories. I talked to her about ideas for trips and projects, but somehow, she never seemed as excited as I was. Instead, she seemed a bit distracted, always caught up in her own plans, her own little world. Then, a shift started happening. At first, I noticed little things. Claire started going out with her friends, Stephanie, Maggie, and Erica, more often. They'd have these girls' nights that, sure, I didn't think too much of at first. But over time, they became more frequent, and she'd come home later each time. She'd say she was catching up or blowing off steam, and I wanted to believe her. Maybe I was just imagining things. But sometimes she'd come back with a perfume I didn't recognize, or she'd laugh off my questions, changing the subject as if I were being ridiculous. I tried to shrug it off, but it gnawed at me. Then came that night. I got home a couple of hours earlier than usual after my meeting got cancelled last minute. I expected the house to be empty, or maybe just a quiet evening with Claire. Instead, I heard voices in the kitchen, her and her friends, laughing like they were at some bar. I paused outside the door, debating whether I should walk in and say hi or just wait until they were done. But something in their voices kept me there, listening. They were laughing hard, and at first, I couldn't make out what they were saying. Then I heard my name, followed by more laughter. Claire was talking about me, about my quirks and routines, and she was doing it with this edge, this mocking tone I'd never heard before. My chest tightened as I heard her call me Boner Boy, laughing so hard she could barely get the words out. I stood there, frozen. It felt like someone had just punched me square in the gut. The other women cackled, making their own jokes about their husbands, saying things that I can't unhear. But hearing Claire talk about me like that, like I was just some joke, someone she had to tolerate, it was like looking at a stranger. I wanted to burst in and confront her, but something held me back. Instead, I quietly slipped away, feeling a mix of humiliation, anger, and confusion twist inside me. After that night, something in me shifted. I couldn't shake the sound of Claire's voice, that laugh, the way she had said, Boner Boy, like I was some punchline. I tried to make sense of it, tried to tell myself it was just her letting loose with her friends, maybe blowing off steam. But the doubt stuck with me like a splinter. I wanted to ask her about it, confront her directly, but every time I tried, I stopped short. What was I supposed to say? Hey, I heard you and your friends mocking me? It felt pathetic, like I'd be proving her point somehow. Instead, I tried to play it cool, acting like I hadn't overheard a thing. But after that night, I started noticing things I hadn't before. Claire would smile when I'd ask how her day was, but it was this distant kind of smile, like she was somewhere else. She'd check her phone more than usual, laughing at texts that she never seemed to want to share with me. Her phone, which used to sit out on the kitchen counter, was now either in her pocket or face down beside her. One night, she left it on the counter while she ran upstairs, and I caught a glimpse of a message from Stephanie. Can't wait for our special night in the woods. Winky Faye. That one line stuck with me, ringing in my head for days. I thought back to her last few girls' nights, how she'd come home later each time, how she seemed more exhilarated, almost like a teenager sneaking back in after curfew. I knew there was more going on, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe I was overthinking. But after so many years together, your gut knows when something's off. A couple of weeks later, I saw her laptop open on the kitchen table while she was upstairs, and my curiosity got the best of me. Her email was still open, and I scanned the screen for anything that might explain the special night text. That's when I found a reservation confirmation for a remote cabin, an out-of-the-way rental, buried deep in the woods. I clicked on the email, and sure enough, it was scheduled for the weekend of her next girls' night. I stood there, staring at the screen, feeling the pieces starting to come together. This was no casual get-together. The whole thing felt planned, secretive. And the part that stung the most was that she hadn't told me a word. I thought about keeping this to myself, but the weight of it was crushing. I needed to talk to someone who might understand, someone who knew what it was like to feel that growing distance. So, I reached out to the only people who could relate, the other husbands. I'd always liked them, Jack, Alan, and Tom. We weren't best friends, but we'd shared enough beers at barbecues and small talk at birthday parties to know we were on the same page about life and marriage. I called each of them up and told them I had something important to talk about, something that couldn't wait. That evening, we met at Jack's place, away from prying eyes and ears. The guys could tell by my face that it was serious. No one wasted time with small talk. I laid it all out for them, starting with what I'd overheard that night in the kitchen and ending with the text message and the cabin reservation. I could see the shock on their faces slowly morph into a kind of grim recognition. When I finally finished, there was a long, heavy silence, and then Jack spoke up. "Mark, I've been feeling it too," he admitted, shaking his head. "Stephanie's been distant, and there's been a weird vibe around Herb girls' nights. I just figured it was all harmless, but now, damn." Alan and Tom nodded along, echoing the same experience. Longer nights out, guarded phones, jokes that suddenly felt like barbs. The four of us sat there, staring at each other as the pieces fell into place. It was like we'd all been ignoring these signals, trying to be the understanding husbands, and now everything felt painfully obvious. Jack, always the practical one, suggested we go to the cabin. Not to cause trouble, just to get the truth. To see for ourselves what was really happening. We agreed that this was the only way to confirm our suspicions, once and for all. As we made our plans, a final twist landed like another punch to the gut. Just a few days before the trip, I stumbled on another message in Claire's email. It was a receipt for a stripper they'd hired for the night. Someone she and Stephanie referred to as the entertainment. I recognized the guy's name immediately. An old acquaintance of mine from way back, a guy I'd worked with briefly years ago. Knowing she'd arranged this, that she'd knowingly hired someone connected to me, felt like salt in the wound. It wasn't just a betrayal. It was personal. This wasn't about being overly cautious or paranoid anymore. It was time to see the truth with my own eyes. The weekend came quicker than any of us expected. We met up early Saturday afternoon, each of us a mix of nerves and anger. None of us saying much as we piled into Tom's truck and drove out to the rental cabin. The drive was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts. I remember gripping the armrest, my mind racing with what we might find and wondering what would happen afterward. The last thing I wanted was to explode in anger, but the betrayal, the lies, had already set something boiling deep inside me. We parked a little way down the road, just out of sight, and made our way through the trees. We weren't sure what we'd find, but the laughter and loud music pouring out from the cabin windows gave us a good idea. We edged closer, keeping low, peering in from just outside the living room window. Inside, the scene was exactly what I feared. Claire, Stephanie, Maggie, and Erica were there, drinking and dancing like they hadn't a care in the world. Empty bottles and glasses littered the table, and clothes were strewn across the furniture. But it was the stripper that really got me. The guy was right in the middle of it all, shirtless, flexing and showing off for them like he was the star of the night. Claire was laughing the hardest, leaning in close, completely wrapped up in the moment. It was like watching a stranger in my wife's body. The other guys looked as wrecked as I felt. Jack's jaw was set, his fists clenched tight. Alan and Tom shared a look that was equal parts shock and disgust. Watching our wives act like teenagers at some wild party, completely dismissing everything we thought our marriages were built on, was surreal. The women we'd married seemed a million miles away from the people laughing in that cabin. We waited, watching, hoping there'd be some moment where they'd stop, maybe mention us, show some sign of guilt. But there was nothing. When the stripper started pulling Claire aside, Leading her toward one of the back rooms, I felt something snap inside me. It was one thing to know, but seeing her cross that line with my own eyes, it shattered any last shred of hope I had that maybe things weren't as bad as they seemed. We didn't even have to say a word to each other. The four of us just looked at one another, each of us knowing we couldn't just stand by any longer. We walked up to the cabin, our footsteps heavy on the porch, and threw the door open without knocking. The music cut out, and the laughter died in an instant. The women's faces went from shock to horror as they took in the sight of us standing there. Claire's face drained of color, her eyes wide and guilty, while the other women fumbled to cover up, scrambling for any excuse. The stripper, caught completely off guard, looked ready to bolt but stood there frozen as if he couldn't decide what was worse, running or facing us. "Care to explain?" I said, my voice coming out low, barely controlled. I looked straight at Claire, waiting for her to say something, anything that might make sense of this. But she just stared at the floor, her mouth opening and closing, with no words coming out. I felt that same crushing weight from before, only this time, it was heavier, final, like there was no coming back from this. The room was tense, filled with the anger and disbelief radiating off all four of us. Jack looked directly at Stephanie, his wife, and asked her, "Is this what girls' night really means to you?" His tone was cold, clipped, like he was trying to keep his emotions in check, but I could see his hands shaking. Stephanie muttered something about it being just for fun, but even she couldn't meet his eyes. One by one, the wives started stumbling through excuses, trying to laugh it off, calling it a harmless night of letting loose. But each excuse sounded emptier than the last. Then Claire finally spoke, barely above a whisper. It was a one-time thing. Just a little escape. Escape from what? I shot back, feeling my face heat with anger. From the life we built. From me. She didn't answer. Instead, she just looked away, biting her lip, as if it was suddenly too much to face the mess she'd made. But her silence said it all. The silence was thick, and nobody seemed to know what to say. Each wife was avoiding eye contact, arms crossed defensively, huddling together almost like they could shield themselves from what they'd just been caught doing. The air felt heavy, loaded with anger and hurt that was almost too much to bear. Tom broke the silence. "So, this is what rekindling friendships looks like, huh?" His voice was filled with sarcasm, but there was something else in it too, something broken. He had that look, the one that comes when someone realizes they've been played for a fool. Alan, who was normally the quietest and most even-tempered of us, finally lost his composure. He gestured at the half-naked guy standing by the hallway, the so-called entertainment for the night. "Who even are you?" he demanded, voice raw and loud. The guy mumbled something about being hired, obviously wanting to disappear. The sight of him just standing there, an awkward reminder of how low our wives had stooped, made my blood boil. I took a step forward, looking directly at Claire. "Tell me why, Claire," I said, voice shaking. "After all these years. Why this? Why here, with him?" I pointed to the guy without breaking my stare. She looked up at me, eyes glossy, almost pleading, like she was searching for some kind of understanding I couldn't possibly give her. She stammered, "It wasn't supposed to be." "It wasn't," she trailed off, and for a second, it seemed like she might break down and say something honest. But then, as if catching herself, she straightened up, put on this defensive mask, and muttered, "It was just supposed to be a release, Mark. Just one night to feel free, to do something different." "Different," I repeated, barely believing the word. "You think betrayal is something you can chalk up to different?" Her face twisted, like I'd said something too close to the truth. But instead of an apology, she came back with, "I didn't expect you to understand. You never understand. You're always working, always lost in your own world, and sometimes I just needed to feel like more than this." She gestured vaguely around the room, as if our whole life was somehow the thing she was really rebelling against. It was a gut punch. All the years, all the loyalty I'd given her, it all felt erased in one moment. Her words hung in the air, cutting deeper than I expected. "You needed to feel like more?" I echoed, trying to keep my voice steady. "After almost 30 years together, raising a family, building a life. I'm not enough for that." Claire's face softened just a bit, but she quickly masked it, looking away. She didn't want to answer, didn't want to face the reality of what she'd just admitted. Instead, she looked to her friends, as if hoping one of them might jump in and back her up. But they were just as rattled, each one looking at the floor or glancing nervously at her husband, avoiding our eyes. Jack wasn't waiting for any more excuses. He looked at Stephanie, his jaw clenched. So what, this was all just some thrill? A joke? We're your husbands, for God's sake. You think we wouldn't find out? Stephanie tried to brush it off, offering a weak smile. Come on, Jack. It was a silly night. Nothing serious. We're all still here, aren't we? But Jack wasn't having it. Nothing serious? You don't think bringing some stranger into our lives, lying to us, humiliating us behind our backs is serious? What kind of marriage did you think we had? Stephanie opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She just stood there, looking as trapped as the rest of them. Alan shook his head slowly, then looked straight at his wife, Maggie, with a deep sadness in his eyes. I thought we were past this high school crap. I thought we were real partners, people who had each other's backs. Not this. Maggie looked like she was about to speak, but Alan's disappointment shut her down. He'd always been quiet and steady, and now the pain on his face seemed to weigh down the entire room. Meanwhile, Claire, still clutching her drink as if it could somehow ground her, took a shaky breath and finally muttered, "It wasn't supposed to be like this. We needed a break, that's all. A way to just feel young, have fun. We weren't trying to hurt anyone." The words were hollow, and I knew she sensed it too. Her excuses only twisted the knife further. You say you weren't trying to hurt anyone, I replied. But here we all are, picking up the pieces of what you threw away for one fun night. Claire's gaze dropped, and I could see the reality starting to settle over her, the weight of what she'd done. But I couldn't let her see my own pain, not yet. Right now, it was about facing the truth, no matter how much it hurt. The silence that followed was brutal, and for a moment, nobody seemed to know what to say or where to look. Part of me hoped that Claire or one of the other women would snap out of it, see the pain on our faces, and finally realize the depth of what they'd done. But they just stood there, avoiding our eyes, like kids caught doing something they knew was wrong but not quite sorry for it. Finally, Tom took a step forward, his voice low but fierce. Is this how it's gonna be now? We're just the fools, sitting at home, holding down the fort while you all go off on these girls' nights for God knows what? If that's how it's been, just say it. Erica, Tom's wife, looked up at him, her face twisted with something like regret, but instead of answering, she just whispered, "It wasn't like that. It was just one night." Tom shook his head, almost laughing bitterly. One night? You really expect me to believe that after seeing this? That this was just a one-time thing? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like a pattern. I don't even know what's real anymore. The weight of his words hung in the air, and for the first time, I could see the women's bravado start to crack. But even then, Claire stayed silent, her face blank. I wanted to hear her admit it, admit that she had lied, admit that this was more than just a mistake. But I knew her too well. If she wasn't saying anything now, it was because she wasn't ready to take responsibility. Not fully. Jack took a deep breath and looked over at the stripper, still awkwardly standing off to the side, clearly wishing he could vanish. You, Jack said sharply. Go. Now. The guy didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed his things, muttering a quick apology before slipping out the front door, leaving nothing but silence in his wake. I turned back to Claire, feeling the anger and disappointment coil up tight inside me. I don't even know who you are anymore, I said, voice barely above a whisper. All these years, I thought we were building something real, something lasting. And now I find out you needed to feel young by throwing it all away. Claire looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a second, I thought I saw a flicker of regret. But she didn't apologize. She didn't explain. She just looked down, biting her lip, as if the reality was finally starting to hit her. But I couldn't tell if it was guilt or just shame from being caught. For the first time since I'd walked through that door, I felt an overwhelming sense of finality, like there was no coming back from this. The woman I'd loved, the life we'd built, it all felt like it was slipping away, leaving nothing but an empty, bitter feeling in its place. Standing there, I felt something cold settle in my chest. It was like the shock had finally given way to something sharper, something that told me that things would never be the same. I took a deep breath, looking around at the women, each one of them struggling to meet her husband's eyes. None of them seemed to realize just how far this had gone, or maybe they just didn't want to face it. Alan spoke up, his voice rough with disbelief. So what happens now? We just go home like nothing happened? Pretend this was some harmless break? His gaze moved slowly from Maggie to the others, waiting for someone to step up and say something that would make this make sense. But all he got were a few nervous glances, a shrug from Stephanie, and more silence. Stephanie tried to answer, but her voice was shaky. We didn't mean for things to go this far. We got caught up in it. It was supposed to be a night to blow off steam. Jack's face hardened, his jaw clenched. Blow off steam? That's your excuse. He let out a bitter laugh. Do you think we don't get tired too? You think we don't sometimes feel the strain of all this? He gestured around, frustrated. But we don't throw away everything we've worked for just because we need a break. We show up. We commit. Maggie, clearly stung, looked down at the floor, twisting her hands nervously. It was Erica who finally spoke, her voice barely audible. We just thought it was harmless. A night to feel free, that's all. None of us thought we'd be hurting anyone. I stepped forward then, looking straight at Claire, unable to hold back any longer. Did you really think this was harmless? That sneaking around, hiring a stranger, and laughing at us behind our backs wouldn't hurt anyone. Claire's face tightened, her eyes glossing over. For a moment, I thought she might finally admit she'd been wrong. But instead, she just looked at me with a strange mix of frustration and defiance. We just wanted something for ourselves, Mark. Something that wasn't about being a wife or a mother, or any of that. Something for yourselves? I repeated, feeling the bitterness rise. You had a life, Claire. You had us. And if that wasn't enough, I stopped, the words catching in my throat. If I kept going, I knew I'd say something I couldn't take back. But the truth was out now. Claire and her friends had crossed a line that couldn't be erased, and we all knew it. This wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. And it was a choice that had shattered the trust we'd spent decades building. The room fell silent, each of us standing in the wreckage of what used to be our lives. We stood there, all of us, as if waiting for someone to say the magic words that would make it all go away. But the silence only deepened, a heavy weight that none of us seemed able to lift. I looked around at the men beside me, seeing my own pain mirrored in their faces, and I knew we were all thinking the same thing. How had we ended up here? How had the people we'd trusted most betrayed us in ways we never saw coming? Jack broke the silence first, his voice steady but laced with a deep hurt. I think we're done here. He looked directly at Stephanie, the hurt in his eyes barely masked. I'll be home later. Don't wait up. And with that, he turned, walking out without looking back. The quiet slam of the door hit harder than any words could have. One by one, the other guys followed, each giving their wife a final look that said everything they hadn't put into words. Alan looked at Maggie with a sadness that made her flinch, as though realizing the depth of the hurt she'd caused. Tom's face was set in a grim expression as he looked at Erica, who seemed frozen in place, her mouth open as if she wanted to call him back but couldn't find the words. Finally, it was just me and Claire left in the room, the silence between us thicker than ever. I wanted to say something that would shake her out of this cold, defensive stance, but all I could feel was this hollow emptiness, a sense that the woman I thought I knew was long gone. I took a shaky breath, the words spilling out before I could stop them. I would have done anything for you, Claire. You and David were everything to me, and if you'd told me you felt this way, we could have fixed it. We could have worked through anything if you'd just been honest. She looked at me then, eyes glossy but guarded, like she wanted to feel sorry, to say something that might change things, but couldn't quite bring herself to do it. She opened her mouth, hesitated, and then closed it again, as if whatever she'd planned to say wasn't enough. Finally, she managed, I'm sorry, Mark. I didn't think it would come to this. But it was too little, too late. The apology felt hollow, as if she was only half in it, too wrapped up in her own guilt to even understand the depth of the hurt she'd caused. I didn't respond. I just looked at her one last time, taking in the face of the woman I'd loved for nearly 3 decades, wondering if I even recognized her anymore. Without another word, I turned and walked out, letting the door close behind me. I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief as I stepped outside, breathing in the cold night air, feeling the weight of betrayal settle like a stone in my chest. In that moment, I knew that everything had changed. Walking to the car, I felt like I was moving in slow motion, my mind still trying to catch up with everything that had happened. The pain was sharp, raw, but there was also this strange numbness spreading through me, as if my mind was shutting down parts of itself just to get me through the next few minutes. The other guys were waiting by the truck, each of them as shaken as I was, eyes staring blankly ahead, lost in their own private hells. Tom looked over at me as I approached. "You okay?" he asked, but his voice sounded as hollow as I felt. None of us were okay, and we all knew it. "Let's just go," I muttered, not wanting to say more. We got in the truck and drove back in silence, the hum of the engine the only sound as we left that cabin, and everything we'd thought we knew about our lives behind us. By the time we got back to town, it was well past midnight. Jack pulled up in front of my house, and the guys offered me those silent nods that held too many unsaid words. I knew they were just as broken as I was, each of us leaving with our own shattered pieces. "Take care, Mark," Alan said, giving my shoulder a quick squeeze. I nodded, climbing out of the truck and watching as they drove off, leaving me standing there in the stillness of the night. I stood there for a minute, staring at my house, trying to make myself walk up to the door. The porch light was still on, casting a soft glow over the yard, as if everything were perfectly normal. But I knew that once I crossed that threshold, I'd be stepping back into a life that no longer felt like mine. Finally, I made myself go inside, each step feeling heavier than the last. I headed straight for the kitchen, poured myself a stiff drink, and sat there at the table, staring into the glass, replaying every moment of the night in my head. I thought of David, of how he'd look at me, confused and hurt, if he ever found out what his mother had done. I thought of the years we'd spent together, every memory now tainted by what I'd seen tonight. In that quiet moment, sitting alone in the dark, it hit me that the life I thought I'd built was gone. It wasn't just a rough patch, a fight we could work through. This was a betrayal so deep, it was like it had cracked the foundation of everything I believed in. And the worst part? I didn't even know where to begin picking up the pieces. I barely slept that night, the scenes from the cabin replaying in my mind over and over again. I kept seeing Claire's face, that blank look, the half-hearted apology, the excuses. I wanted to believe there was some way this could all make sense, that maybe, just maybe, we could work through it if she could show even an ounce of real regret. But every time I replayed the moment, it was clear, she wasn't sorry for what she'd done, just sorry she got caught. The morning light started creeping in through the kitchen window, but it didn't bring any sense of relief. I hadn't moved from the table, still nursing the same drink I'd poured hours before. I thought about David and his family. How was I supposed to tell him? Should I tell him at all? There were so many things to think about, but everything felt tangled up, impossible to unravel. Just as I was thinking about this, my phone buzzed. I looked down to see a message from Claire. "Please come home so we can talk." It was like a knife twisting in my chest. Home. As if the word could still mean the same thing after what I'd seen. But the truth was, I needed answers. I needed to understand why she'd thrown away everything we had. So, after splashing some cold water on my face and bracing myself, I got in the car and drove back to the house, my mind a blur of questions and anger. When I got there, Claire was waiting in the living room, looking more fragile than I'd ever seen her. She must have been up all night too, judging by the shadows under her eyes. But instead of feeling any sympathy, all I could feel was this deep, gnawing resentment. She motioned for me to sit, and after a long pause, she finally started talking. "Mark, I don't even know where to start," she began, her voice low and strained. She looked up at me, almost pleading, and I waited, holding back everything I wanted to shout. "Then start by telling me why," I replied, my voice barely a whisper. "Why, after everything we've built, did you feel the need to tear it all down?" She took a shaky breath, and for a moment, I thought I saw real regret flash across her face. But what she said next hit me like a punch to the gut. Claire looked down, twisting her hands nervously, and finally said, I don't know, Mark. I just felt trapped." Her voice was soft, almost pleading, as if she wanted me to understand, to feel sympathy for her. It's been years of routine, the same life, day in and day out. And somewhere along the way, I guess I lost myself. I wanted to feel free, like I could be someone other than just your wife or David's mom. Her words struck me as selfish, but I kept my face steady, letting her continue. She paused, choosing her words carefully, which only made them sting more. I didn't set out to hurt you, Mark. I just wanted one night to feel like myself again. I didn't think it would mean losing everything. Losing everything? I repeated, the bitterness sharp in my voice. Claire, it was your choice to do this. You're not a victim here. You knew exactly what you were doing when you planned that night, and now you're trying to say it was just a way to feel free? She flinched at my words but didn't look away. I know it sounds awful, but you have to believe me, it wasn't about you. It was about me trying to find some piece of myself I felt I'd lost. I felt the anger rise, but I struggled to keep calm. You know what, Claire? If you just told me you felt this way, we could have worked on it. Together. But instead, you decided to find yourself by betraying the very life we built. You went behind my back, laughing at me with your friends, making a mockery of our marriage. She reached out as if to touch my arm, but I pulled back and she stopped, her hand lingering in the air before she let it drop. I never wanted it to come to this, she said softly, her voice almost breaking. I know I hurt you, and I'll always regret that. But please believe me, it wasn't all a lie. I looked at her, and for the first time, I realized I didn't feel anything close to the love I once had for her. All I saw was a woman who had made her choice, and now we were both left with the fallout. I stood up, taking one last look at her. This isn't something we can just fix, Claire. You didn't just hurt me, you destroyed us. And with that, I turned and walked out, leaving her sitting there, alone in the silence she had created. Walking out of that house felt like stepping away from a life I barely recognized anymore. The air felt sharp, cold, and somehow refreshing, like the first real breath I'd taken in months. But it wasn't freedom, it was emptiness. Every part of me felt raw, hollowed out by everything Claire had said. There was no apology that could fix what she'd done, and yet she seemed desperate to make me understand her side, as if that would erase the betrayal. For the next few days, I kept my distance, staying with a friend from work who barely asked any questions, just opened his door, handed me a beer, and let me have the silence I needed. At night, I lay awake, going over every memory, every moment where I might have missed a sign. I questioned everything I'd ever known about our marriage, our life together. It was like she'd rewritten our history with one selfish choice. And then there was David. I knew I couldn't keep this from him forever, but the idea of telling him what his mother had done, it weighed on me like a lead blanket. David looked up to her, to us, like we were something steady in his life. I didn't want to take that away from him, but I also couldn't lie to him, especially not after everything that had come out in the open. On the fourth day, I finally reached out, asking him to meet me for lunch. We met at a small diner on the edge of town, the kind of place we used to go when he was a kid, just the two of us. He looked happy to see me, relaxed, not sensing the storm underneath. We chatted a bit, making small talk until he finally picked up on the tension in my face. "Dad," he said, his smile fading, "is something wrong? You seem off." I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what I had to say. "David," I began, my voice wavering a bit, "there's something I need to tell you. Something you deserve to know." As I spoke, I saw the light in his eyes dim, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief, then finally, to heartbreak. He listened quietly, his jaw clenched, eyes downcast, barely moving except to nod. When I finished, he didn't say anything for a long time, just stared at the table, as if he needed to hold himself together. "So, it was all a lie," he finally whispered, more to himself than to me. "All those years. They didn't mean what I thought they did." I wanted to tell him it wasn't all a lie, to remind him of the good times, the family memories, the love that had once felt so real. But I couldn't. Not now, not when we were both just trying to process the pieces of a life that suddenly didn't make sense anymore. All I could do was reach out, put a hand on his shoulder, and tell him, "We'll get through this, David. You and me, we'll get through this." And in that moment, I knew that whatever happened next, my focus would be on him and on rebuilding a life we could both believe in again. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork, quiet conversations with lawyers, and the kind of sad routines you fall into when you're just trying to keep moving. I'd filed for divorce not long after talking to David. There was no way back from what had happened, and Claire didn't put up a fight. Maybe she knew, somewhere deep down, that she'd burned too many bridges to rebuild. David reached out often, checking in on me, making sure I was eating, staying busy. He'd been hit hard by all of this, maybe even harder than I had, because he was grappling not only with the loss of his family but also the memory of who he thought his mother was. I could see him struggling, his own anger bubbling beneath the surface, but he kept it in check. He was strong like that. One evening, a few weeks after everything, he invited me over to his place for dinner with his wife and kids. It was one of the first times in months that I'd felt genuinely welcomed somewhere, like I was still a part of something, still tethered to family. Watching David interact with his kids, seeing him give them the security and warmth that felt so absent now in my own life, it was grounding, like a reminder that some things could still be real, that not everything was a lie. Later that night, as I was getting ready to leave, David pulled me aside. "Dad," he said, his voice quiet but steady, "I just want you to know, you've always been the example I looked up to. Even now, after all this, I still believe in the kind of person you taught me to be." It was the closest I'd come to breaking down since that night at the cabin. Hearing those words, seeing the respect in his eyes, despite everything, there was a comfort in knowing that not all was lost. There were still things worth holding on to, still values that mattered. As I drove home, I realized that this wasn't the end, not really. Claire's betrayal had torn our family apart, but in the wreckage, there were pieces that still mattered, pieces I could build a new life around. David, my grandkids, even myself, I still had things to fight for, things to look forward to. And as much as the hurt still lingered, I knew that one day, the weight of it all would be lighter. In the meantime, I'd take it one day at a time, step by step, toward something better, something honest. And in those small moments, those dinners with David, those afternoons with my grandkids, those quiet mornings where I could just sit with my own thoughts, I'd find a new kind of peace. A peace that belonged entirely to me.